Hi guys, it's Adam from Rally Raid, and I've put this video together to help people that are doing their own fork kits on the CRF300L. It's going to be quite a long video, but there's a lot of useful information for it, so we might as well get started and we can talk about it as we go along. So the first thing we need to do is lift the bike up on a suitable centre stand, get the front wheel slightly off the floor, and then we can go ahead with a 10mm socket or spanner and start by loosening the front pinch bolts on the spindle. They don't need to come all the way out, just loose enough to release the tension on the spindle and let that spin freely. So we need to go with a 14mm hex bit or a CRF trail spanner if you've got one of those, and just remove the front wheel spindle from the bike. Don't put it on the floor like that, it's purely because we're filming and you can see I've got no extra hands. So we need an M5 Allen key or hex bit, and we can start by removing the fork protectors. The right leg is the same for everyone, but the left leg will differ if you have an ABS or non-ABS model of the bike. With the right leg done, we can move to the left now. You can see there's the ABS sensor in the casting, and the cable runs under the plastic guard and up towards the top of the caliper mount. So you can see here a closer look how the cable runs underneath the flange on the inside of the plastic guard. It's very important that you don't put it on top of the flange because it'll split the cable. So go ahead and remove the 3 bolts like you did on the right hand leg, and then we can work on getting the cable unhooked from the caliper mount and then finally the sensor. With these 3 bolts out, we just need to squeeze the 2 teeth on the back of the plastic clip, and this will release it from the casting. Now we can turn the fork leg round and lift the plastic fork guard, and that will reveal the ABS sensor and its retaining bolt. I'm just going to go in now with an 8mm socket, and I'm going to remove the retaining bolt from the ABS sensor, and once I've done that we can lift this plastic guard up and reveal the wiring, and you can see the shape of it there. That's quite important. It needs to go back in that shape below the flange. So now we can finish up with a 12mm socket, take the brake caliper off the lower leg, and that leaves both legs ready to be removed from the bike. Now's a good time to organise all your bolts, put them somewhere safe in a bag, whatever your system is, just so you know that they're from this part of the assembly. To remove the forks from the bike, we need to go to the upper triple clamp and loosen the pinch bolts using a 10mm spanner. I suggest a spanner for this because a socket can slip off a little bit easier. You can see here, this is the smallest socket I have and it didn't quite fit, so you don't want to risk damaging these quite soft screws. Next up, with a 30mm spanner, we're going to go ahead and loosen the top caps of each fork. Only by about 1 turn. This is because it's much easier to do it when it's in the bike. Now we can move to the lower pinch bolts, just loosen them out and slide the forks out. It's also a good time to look for any corrosion around the forks, especially on the triple clamps, as this is where it can often start on older bikes. You can see these legs are pretty new, but it's still a good idea to give them a good clean down before you start working on them, just to minimise any dust or dirt around your oils and suspension components. I'm just using some frog tape here. It's kind of like masking tape, and that's just to protect fork legs whilst you're working on them in the fork vise. It's not necessary, but I always recommend it. So we've got the left leg up on the bench first, and our first job is to get the M8 bolt out of the bottom of the cartridge. We need a 6mm hex bit for this. I really recommend using an impact driver. You can see I've got an extended bit there. You can use hand tools like this one here, but it's not always successful. Even with an impact driver, you can see the cartridge is spinning in both directions, so we need to change that. What we're going to do is flip the fork leg around the other way, remove the top cap using a 30mm spanner, and drain the oil. Once we've drained the oil, we can close the leg and pull on the cartridge. Pulling on the cartridge engages the threads in the M8 retaining bolt, and it allows the bolt to actually come undone, and then you can pull the cartridge out once the bolt is released. Sometimes there's way too much Loctite on the M8 bolt, and that causes it to bleed into the leg, and it's quite difficult to actually get undone from the cartridge. You just have to persevere, I'm afraid. So we are going to cover the seals in this video. This customer's upgrading to the dual compound SKF option. I'm going in with a plastic squeegee first, and I use this because it lets me put a lot of pressure between the seal and the fork leg, and then once that's kind of cracked, I'll just go along with a small screwdriver and gently pry the seal all the way around. Once the dust seal is removed, it gives us access to the internals. We need to remove the steel retaining clip. This is done by starting at one end of it. There's 3 indents that go around the clip, and you need to work your way around gently unpicking these from the recess. Check for any corrosion in there on older bikes, as it often starts on the steel clip. Now we can start by braking the leg. At full extension, use rapid but moderate force a number of times, and eventually you will pull the bushes apart and brake the leg. This one took a few more than usual, and there you can see the rest of our fork components. Now we can break down our internals. We're going to start with the large bush, and we just need to slightly expand it using a screwdriver and slide it over the top. Next we're going to use our secondary bush. There's a steel washer. Our oil seal will come next. This is often caught on the recess. You'll see there you need to give it quite a squeeze to get it over. This is important later on. After that, our retaining clip, and then the final dust seal. You can see here I'm laying out the components in order. It's very important when you take them off the bike that you keep them in order and the correct orientation that they were removed from, and this makes the job a whole lot easier. So we have our nice new dual compound SKF seals here that we're going to fit. So there's a couple of things we need to do first. I'm going to take a small amount of oil just in the oil cap and pre-lube everything that I fit to the leg, including the seals on the inside faces, and that just helps everything work better from the get-go. You can see here I'm using what's called a fork cap, and this just helps things go on without damaging them. If you don't have one of these, you can always use a strong plastic bag, for example, and it has a very similar effect. So I've lubed that up, and I'm lubing the inside faces of the seals up with some fork oil. You have enough fork oil of the bottle that's provided with your fork kit to do that. That's not an issue. It's only 20-25 milliliters at most. So I just needed to tap the cap there. So that's the dust seal on. It's going to be followed by our steel retaining ring, and that's going to be followed by our oil seal. So take note of the orientation of the oil seal, and I'm lubing this up. These are the dual compounds. You can see the orange and the green, and I'm just coating the insides there with fork oil to make sure they're fully lubricated. So for me, with this fork cap, the oil seal is just a little bit too tight, so I have to remove it and put it on manually. So I just have to take a bit more care. And you can see there, just gently pull it down and slide it up and down, including the dust seal, just to give them a bit of action, and it'll get rid of any excess oil as well. So now we can go ahead and put our steel washer on next, slide that down the leg, and this is going to be followed by our secondary bush. So remember the orientation from before, that's why it's so important. Now we just need to slightly expand this, just like we took it off, and slide it down the leg. Just be careful of your nails and fingers. Just check that that's nicely seated and give everything a once over. There should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 components before you finish this. This is just a little clip for anyone that did mess up and forget their orientation. So I'm just showing you each component in its orientation. The steel washer does actually have an orientation. You can see it's completely flat on one side and domed on the other slightly. So now we need to reassemble the leg. So I'm putting the steel washer and the 2 bushes at the top of the leg, everything else at the bottom, and then I'm sliding the leg down, leaving about 150 millimeters roughly extended out of the gold outer. Then I'm going to use one of the 43mm fork seal drivers that's available online from our web shop, and we're going to drive the steel washer against the bushes to secure the leg. There is a difference in noise and feeling when the bushes are properly seated. I also rotate the fork seal driver every couple of hits to make sure it's evenly seated. So I'm going to replay that just so you can hear the noise. So hopefully that was obvious as it could be through video. There should be about 16 to 18 millimeters from the top of the steel washer to the recess for the clip. So we're going to slide the oil seal down now using our fork seal driver. We're going to drive that home as well. So it's quite important. These seals do require a certain type of driver, and that's why we recommend using our one. So we're going to use again rapid moderate force driving that home. It's important we get the oil seal correctly seated. If it isn't seated all the way, it means that it can push and dislodge the steel retaining clip, which is a really bad thing. So just make sure you take your time and you're confident with what you're doing here. So here's a better look at the oil seal correctly seated. You can see the distance between the recess there. I'm trying to point it out with a pick. So next we need to fit our steel retaining clip. So that's the recess we're aiming for. So I'm going to pull the clip down and compress it. And then I'm going to work my way around in the same way that we took it off, using each indentation to press it and into the recess. Once it's in the recess, I'm going to double check it. Like I said, it's really important, so I want to check it's correctly seated the whole way around and be really confident before I install that dust seal. If there's any excess oil on the leg at this point, just wipe it away. You don't want it to be dripping beneath there. Now we're going to go ahead and fit the dust seal finally. So I'm just using my hands to do this. They're quite soft compared to OEM, so you can push fit them, and this reduces the risk of damage. Next up, we're going to prepare the cartridge for fitting and filling using a 17mm spanner on the nut on the fork guide and the 22mm hex spanner provided. You can unscrew the fork cap from the cartridge. Next, we need to take that off carefully and remove the plastic washers. Sometimes these are inside the fork cap with a little bit of grease sticking them together. Here they're separated, so there's one thick and two thin, so you need to keep those safe with the fork cap. Next, I'm going to check the compression needle, just make sure that's not sticky. It should have about 4mm of action. Next up, we're going to fit the spring to the cartridge, so you can see they're using a 5mm Allen key in the hole in the fork guide. I'm going to put the spring over the fork guide on top of the thick plastic washer that remains on the leg, and I'm going to turn the spring in a clockwise motion, and that's going to lift up the cartridge and the fork guide so I can put the fork cap back on. So here we are at the top now. I've got my Allen key holding the spring there and putting the washers back on, so I've got my one thick, two thin in the fork cap, and just gently by hand putting that back on. So I'm using the 22mm hex on the preload nut there, the same as we did before. It's very important that you turn this and attach it by the hex, not the pin spanner. So there you can see the cartridge next to the leg, and we're going to go ahead and slide it into the leg now. Gently screw the cap into the leg by hand. This doesn't need to be super tight at the moment, so just get it secure, and then we'll go in after with our pin spanner that's provided in the kit, and that locates into the recesses in the fork cap, so just be careful, you don't want to damage your brand new parts. And then just give that a little tug. Like I say, it doesn't need to be super tight because you'll spin it in the fork vise, and we're going to tighten it up in the bike later anyway. So now we can start with the filling process. So I'm going to pour out 450 to 475 milliliters of oil. It's not critical at this point as long as it's somewhere between those numbers. If this is a fork service, the cartridge will already have some oil in it, so you won't get the full amount in, so say 425. So the last step before filling is just removing any old Loctite and degreasing the plug bolt. So I'm just using a wire brush for that to brush away any of the old remaining Loctite from the Honda factory. After that, we just need to refit the copper crush washer and then apply some Loctite. The reason I'm doing it now is it's easier than doing it when you've got the forks full of oil in your hands. So now we need to do something that's called back bleeding. Because of the capacity and the design of these forks, we find it's better to fill them from the bottom instead of the top. This does take a little bit of time, but we find it's generally worth it. So we're going to go ahead and fill the cavity in the bottom of the left leg with oil. That's the 5-way oil that we provided with your kit. And then we're going to cover it with our hand and compress the fork against the spring, which is essentially going to pump the oil through the system and the cartridge. So this is a long process. It does take quite a few times to get that full amount of oil in the leg. But we just find it's the best way. So I'm just doing it slowly here to show you. It does sometimes gargle and spit at you, so just take care not to get any in your eyes or on your face or anything like that, and just keep doing that. If you are building up pressure, just make sure that you're fully bringing the fork back up to its full extension before releasing your hand. So you can see me here just making my way through the filling process for the left leg. And it's just a repeated pump. This is because the gravity wouldn't allow you to fill it from the top. It's important as we get to the bottom of our beaker of oil, we want to try and finish with no air gap, so the oil pretty much all the way up to the threads in the bottom of the cartridge, and that reduces the need for bleeding as well. I actually needed a tiny bit more oil just to bring it up to the threads, which isn't an issue because we're going to change the oil height anyway, and then I reinstalled the retaining bolt. Because it was spinning again, I just gave it a little zip with the impact driver, and the instant torque just nips the threads into engagement. Now we're going to revert the leg, and using the pin spanner and the recesses, we're going to gently unscrew the cap. As we do this, we just want to be aware that the gold outer leg will fall down if not supported by your hand. With the outer lowered, I'm going to go back in with the 17mm spanner that we did before, and I'm going to engage it on the top of the fork guide, And again, with the 22mm hex spanner on the stainless preload nut, I'm going to undo the top cap and remove it once again. This is a step backwards because we need to bleed the leg correctly, because there will be some amount of air still left in the system. So I'm just taking that off carefully. Again, remember the plastic washers, I'm taking all those off together. They're still in the cap there, you can see the oil generally makes them stick together. So just take care when removing the spanner, and then we're going to gently remove the spring, removing as little oil as possible. So the way the damper rod fell through the stroke then, that shows us that there's air in the system, so we can sort that out now. I'm showing you a kind of worst case example here, so you can see even when I'm pumping the damper rod up and down, the air isn't fully expelling itself, and the reason is because there's not enough oil in the leg. So what I need to do is top up the leg slightly to make sure that under full extension the cartridge isn't taking air in. So you can see it's a little bit better, but at the top of the stroke it's still not there. So I'm just pouring a bit more oil in, and then you can see it's nice and smooth. I've got resistance the whole way through the stroke. So now we're going to measure our air gap. That's a vital measurement for setting up forks, because of oil left over in cartridge and air and things like that. Measuring volume is quite difficult, so we measure by air gap. So on the CRF level 2 kit on 300, we're looking for 100mm of air gap, and that's the distance between the recess and the gold fork that you see just behind the ruler there and the surface level of the oil. So I'm using it in a dipstick fashion. I do have a suction method for this, but I'm using tools that you're most likely to have in your garage. So I'm just keep repeating, and there we go, I've just hit it there. With the cartridge correctly bled and our air height set, we're now ready to do our final assembly. So I'm just checking that the spring guide is correctly mounted by screwing it in a clockwise way. I'm sliding the spring over, and then we're going to use the same method of the 5mm Allen key in the hole inside the spring guide, and we're going to rotate that until it brings our spring down. Now we're going to carefully screw on by hand the cap. I'm going to put the washers back on, so it's the too thin one thick. The thick one is in the cap for me there, it's stuck in with a bit of oil, and just screw that down gently by hand. Then I can release the spring, and we're going to go back in with a 17mm spanner on the spring guide. You can see there that one of the washers fell below the spanner. That's not a big deal. So using a 22mm hex on the top stainless preload nut, we're going to tighten these two pieces together and check they are nice and secure before we continue any further. With everything secure, I've just checked that the spring is correctly seated in the fork cap, as it sometimes can catch, and we're going to bring the gold outer up and screw it in by hand, just those first couple of threads. And then we're going to use the pin spanner on the internal recesses on the fork cap, not the stainless 22mm preload spanner, to tighten that against the gold outer. Okay, so now we're on to the right hand leg. This leg is easier than the left hand leg, it's less technical, there's no cartridge, so all we have to do is, using a 30mm spanner, unscrew the top cap that we'd already loosened when it was in the bike, and we're going to have to get ready to catch some oil. So this leg has about 350ml of oil in it as standard, and we just need to spend some time to drain that out. So just fully extend the leg and leave it to drain for a couple of minutes and grab a coffee or something. So now we need to take the top cap off the fork. We're going to use a 17mm spanner and a 14mm spanner used against each other and remove the cap from the fork. So this is going to allow us to break the leg down. We're going to do this in exactly the same way as we did with the previous leg. Just tighten that nut back up, flip the leg round, and repeated moderate force just to break the leg apart. With the fork broken down, the inner chrome, you can see there's a collar and a circlip here. The collar, it's tapered, so it relies on pressure to keep the circlip in. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that, and I'm going to show you two of them now. So using the tool provided, you can see you can push down the tapered collar about 2mm, and it reveals the circlip for you to work on. So depending, some bikes you can do it with a pair of picks. I've got some picks here, I'm going to show you how to do that. But other bikes, the collar just pops right back up, and the only way to really do it safely is by drilling, which I'm also going to show you. I wouldn't recommend that everyone does it this way, so I've done, I pushed the collar down slightly, and I'm showing you here with this small pick. I'm just getting behind the circlip. It's a very fine pick, and working my way round, and then I can just flip it like that and remove the thing in one. You want to keep some downwards pressure at all times while you're doing this, because the spring is obviously pushing against the collar, so try and reduce that if you can. I'm going to put this back in now and show you the way that I recommend to do it for most people. So we need to align the drill jig with one end of the circlip, and once we've done that we can slide the spring pusher over, and you can see there's a gap of about 2-3 millimeters there. So when we compress down, it compresses the spring down and engages the circlip. This allows us to drill it out. So with the drill provided, we're going to go in, put pressure to lock it down, and then we're just going to hit that. It doesn't take a lot to go through, and that's it. That's all you need to do. So we've just got the spring pusher alone on now. We're going to compress the spring to release the circlip, and I'm just using a small pick. You can use the drill as well. Just be careful, it's sharp and you don't want to cut your hands. Next we're going to take out that OEM spring, and just be careful of any remaining oil that you don't drip that everywhere. And then we have to get the plastic washer out of the bottom. This is usually quite frustrating, and the oil suctions it into the bottom of the leg. So you have to give it a good tap or wait a while, and it will eventually slide down to the top of the leg. There you can see it. Once everything's disassembled, this is the point when we're now going to do the seal change on this leg. This is exactly the same as we did before, so I'm not going to take you through each step. But I will show you a sped up montage of me doing it, just so you understand the concept. Once I'm done with the seal fitting, I'm going to revert the leg so it's the right way up, make sure it's all clean, ready to work on and prepared for assembly. So we're going to start with assembly, and we're going to drop in the OEM white plastic spacer, followed by the black plastic spacer that is provided as part of your kit. Just a quick note, there is a difference between the 250 and the 300 models in this step, so please refer to the instructions. After that we're going to be putting the spring in. The fork spring is a 435 length and the spring rate of your choice. In the right hand leg it's always 435 for level 1 or 2. Level 1 it's 390 in the left leg. So we're pouring in the 400 milliliters of oil that this leg requires. This doesn't need to be bled in any way, so it just goes straight in on top of the fork spring, and it's as easy as that. Once that's installed, we're going to put the steel washer on top of the fork spring. This contacts the preload system. It's important at this point to loosen anti-clockwise completely the preload adjustment screw using the 22mm hex to make sure it's at minimum preload. I'm going to drop that in, and using a pair of circlip pliers on the circlip, we're going to get that circlip seated in the recess on the chrome leg. Again, this retaining circlip is very vital, so you really want to make sure that you're confident in what you've done and always check your work at this point. So I checked the preload assembly, I'm confident that the circlip is doing its job, so now I'm just bringing the gold tube up to the fork cap and screwing it in by hand. You can see I generally do it by holding my hand stationary and moving the gold fork tube around the fork cap. Then we just go in with our pin spanner in the recesses and get that nice and tight up against the fork leg and remove any tape. When it comes to reassembly, I'm putting a little bit of ACF50 or something similar on the inside of the triple clamps, and that's just to stop any corrosion down the line. So I'm sliding the forks up. I generally have about 2 to 3 millimeters of gold outer showing out the top of the triple clamps at the lowest point, and then I'm using a 10mm socket on this side on the lowers to just fasten those forks in. I don't have a problem using a socket on the lowers because there's plenty of space. It's really just the upper bolts where the spanner wheel applies. So with the leg fastened via the triple clamp, we can go in now with the pin spanner and tighten our top cap. And then I'm just going to take a step backwards, loosen them off and align the writing on the leg to the rider, obviously in their seated position. Now I'm happy with the height and the rotation of the leg. I'm going to lock this into place using the top triple clamp pinch bolts and a 10mm spanner to tighten them up. Now that both legs are securely fastened in the bike, I'm going to go ahead with the lower reassembly. So I'm going to start with the brake caliper and the 2 bolts. So we have a 12mm socket, and I'm using some Loctite on these, as I always recommend to do that with brake calipers. Once we've done that, we can just pop the plastic retaining clip for the ABS sensor wire in and start by doing the caliper bolts up. Again, using a small amount of Loctite, I'm going to put the ABS sensor back into place using an 8mm socket and extension bar. This is a very fine thread, so you just want to be careful as you do it. You can see I've got the routing roughly where it needs to go already, so I just need to pull the plastic cover over the routing and make sure I'm happy with that. With that secure now, we just need to lift the plastic guard over the ABS sensor cable. Take a lot of care when doing this. It's just a bit of patience really. You just need to slowly maneuver it over it like I'm doing there, and you need to be sure that the ABS sensor cable isn't under any pressure or being pinched by any of the plastics. Next up, we just need to get the bolts for the fork protector in using the 5mm Allen key or hex bit. When you're doing this, they do have a shoulder on them and it does like to grab on the plastic, so you just need to wiggle it around a little bit to make sure they're correctly aligned. Also be careful that they're not rubbing on the fork. These bikes do have a habit of letting the protectors rub on the gold fork and damaging them. So just using, I've got a flat pick here that I use for this. I'm pulling the pads apart in the front caliper just to make sure there's plenty of room to get the wheel and the disc back in easily. We're going to go ahead and put the wheel back into place. There is an important note about the suspension, so because we've gone to a stronger top out spring, when the legs aren't connected via the front spindle, one leg is slightly longer than the other. This means that the cartridge leg protrudes roughly about 6mm on average further out because the top out spring isn't using it for support. So you can see here, just through the centre of that spindle, it doesn't quite line up. So when you're refitting your front wheel, what you need to do is get on one side of the bike, the right side, and I use my left hand over the front of the tyre or the wheel, and I just pull the left leg up a couple of millimeters, and this lets me align the front spindles because they do have a habit of wandering if you're not careful, and it just lets me support the left leg to make sure I'm correctly aligned and not causing any damage to the threads. Now that we've got everything loosely tightened on the front end, what I'm going to go ahead and do is undo the lower triple clamp pinch bolts again and make sure that the front wheel axle pinch bolts are undone as well. So I'm going to bounce the front end, and this helps with alignment. If you ever have a crash or anything like that, it's also a good thing to do after that. So I've got the top triple clamp bolts tight, I've got the lower triple clamp bolts loose and the pinch bolts loose on the front wheel, and I'm just going to compress the bike a couple of times and just get everything nice and centered before continuing. Now I'm just going back, I'm starting in order of top down, so I'm going checking the top triple clamp bolts down to the lower triple clamp bolts, and then I will finish up with the pinch bolts on the front wheel. And then that is the best thing that I've found for just making sure your front end alignment is on point once you've done something to the bike. So at this point, before you put the lovely stickers on your bike, you want to go back over everything you've done, double check it, be happy that you've tightened everything to the correct torque settings. If we haven't specified torque settings in the instructions, then please refer to Honda's OEM torque settings. I hope this has helped everyone. If there's any other questions that you think I might have missed, drop them in the comment and I'll do my best to help you out with answers to those.